The wind in this city doesn't just blow, it hunts. It screams through the glass and steel canyons of downtown, searching for any crack in a window pane or a gap in a threadbare coat to sink its icy teeth into your bones. Here in our corner of the world, a cramped, one-bedroom walk-up where the radiator clanks like a dying ghost and the wallpaper is peeling away like sunburnt skin, the winter feels less like a season and more like a predator. My name is Sarah, and for a long time, the only shield I had against that relentless cold was the man standing across our tiny kitchen, his silhouette framed by the dim, flickering light of a single bare bulb. Jack. Even the sound of his name in my mind feels like a hearth. He was tired. I could see it in the way his shoulders slumped, a heavy weight that the world had been piling on him for years. We were the invisible machinery of the American dream, the grease that kept the gears turning while we remained stuck in the mud. We worked at Thorne's Bistro, a place of polished mahogany, velvet curtains, and crystal glassware that cost more than our combined monthly rent. To the patrons who sat under those warm, golden chandeliers, we were just hands that moved plates and voices that recited specials. But to each other we were everything. We lived paycheck to paycheck, our bank account a constant tally of subtractions, yet within the 4 drafty walls of our apartment, we had a wealth that Chef Marcus Thorne could never buy with all the Michelin stars in the world. "Hey, Sarah," Jack whispered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that always managed to settle the fluttering anxiety in my chest. He held out a white plastic container, the leftovers from our staff meal at the end of a grueling 12-hour shift. It was a meager offering, cold pasta tossed in a thinning garlic oil, but to us, it was a feast. We sat on the floor because the legs of our only table had finally given way, the linoleum cold beneath us. Jack opened the lid, the steam rising like a small, fleeting ghost in the frigid air. Without a word, he took the plastic fork and carefully partitioned the meal. He pushed the larger half toward me, his eyes, worn but endlessly kind, meeting mine. It was a ritual we performed every night, a silent exchange of "I love you" through the medium of calories and starch. "Jack, you worked the line all night. You need the energy more than I do," I protested, though my stomach gave a traitorous growl. He just smiled, a small weary curve of his lips that reached up to the crinkles around his eyes. "I'm good, Sarah. Seeing you eat, it fills me up in a way food doesn't. Just take it. Please." I took a bite, the warmth of the meal spreading through me, but it was the warmth of his gaze that truly sustained me. In that moment, the peeling wallpaper and the whistling wind didn't matter. We were together. We were a fortress. But even then, at the height of our quiet intimacy, a strange shadow seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision. There was a coldness in the air that had nothing to do with the winter, a subtle, creeping dread that felt like a hand brushing against the back of my neck. Thorne's Bistro was a place of high ceilings and deep secrets. Chef Marcus Thorne, a man whose ambition was a jagged, hungry thing, had been acting differently lately. The bistro was failing, the critics were calling his menus dated, and the debt collectors were beginning to circle. I had seen him in the walk-in freezer, staring into the frost with eyes that looked hollowed out, muttering about a signature that would change everything. He spoke of ancient things, of the price of perfection, in a tone that made the hairs on my arms stand up. In the kitchen, the air always smelled of rosemary and red wine, but lately, there was something else, a faint metallic tang that lingered on the tongue, like the taste of a copper penny or a fresh cut. "Do you ever feel like this city is waiting for us to slip?" I asked Jack, my voice trembling slightly as the wind rattled the window pane. Jack reached out, his hand, calloused and stained with the faint scars of 1,000 kitchen burns, covering mine. His touch was solid, grounding, the only thing in this shifting, cruel world that felt real. "Let it wait, Sarah. As long as we're together, it can't take us. We're going to get out of here. I'm going to make sure of it." His promise hung in the air, beautiful and fragile as a spun glass ornament. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that our love was a currency strong enough to pay the toll of our survival. But as I looked at him, I noticed a strange rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere in the building. It wasn't the radiator. It was deeper, slower, a heavy, wet sound like a footstep in the mud or a fist hitting a carcass. Thump, thump, thump. Jack didn't seem to hear it. He was too busy looking at me, his eyes full of a desperate, shining hope. He didn't see the way the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to stretch and lean toward him, like they were hungry. He didn't notice the way the light bulb flickered in a pattern that felt like a warning in a language we had forgotten how to speak. "We should get some sleep," he said softly, pulling me closer. "Tomorrow is another day. Marcus said he has a big announcement for the staff. Maybe things are finally turning around." I nodded, resting my head against his chest. I listened to the steady beat of his heart, the real heart, the one that beat with life and kindness. It was the only music I ever needed. I let the sound of it drown out the whistling wind and the rhythmic thumping in the walls. I let the warmth of his body shield me from the draft. But as I drifted toward sleep, a terrifying thought intruded upon my peace. In the dark, the bistro didn't feel like a restaurant. It felt like a mouth. And Marcus Thorne wasn't just a chef. He was a priest of some dark, urban ritual, waiting for the perfect sacrifice to restore his altar. I squeezed Jack's hand tighter, my nails digging into his skin, as if I could anchor him to the earth, to this room, to me. I love you, Jack, I whispered into the darkness. I love you more, Sarah, he replied, his voice already heavy with dreams. Outside, the American winter howled in frustration, unable to breach our small sanctuary. But the cold wasn't just outside anymore. It was waiting in the ingredients of the morning. It was waiting in the sharpened knives of Thorne's bistro. It was waiting for a heart that was pure enough to be stolen. And as the last light in our apartment died, the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was expectant. It was the silence of a predator that had finally found its prey. I closed my eyes, clinging to the warmth of his skin, unaware that this was the last night I would ever feel the pulse of his living heart against mine. The sweet poverty of our lives was about to be paid for in a currency far more precious than gold, and the debt would be written in blood and bone before the first snow of February hit the ground. The morning light that filtered through the grease-stained windows of Thorne's bistro was thin and sickly, more of a gray smudge than a herald of a new day. Inside, the bistro was a cathedral of fading opulence, the velvet curtains heavy with the dust of better years and the mahogany tables polished to a shine that felt like a lie. As I walked through the service entrance, the air didn't smell like the expensive truffle oil or the aged balsamic we boasted on our menu. It smelled like bleach trying to hide something ancient and sour. My name is Sarah, and that morning the bistro felt less like a place of work and more like a stomach, slowly, methodically beginning to churn. Chef Marcus Thorne was already there, a frantic ghost in a stained white coat. He wasn't the arrogant, statuesque man who had once graced the covers of local food magazines. He looked like he was being hollowed out from the inside. His eyes were bloodshot, darting to corners of the room as if he were tracking the movement of invisible insects. He stood by the industrial pass-through, clutching a stack of red-inked final notices so tightly his knuckles were white as bone. Bankruptcy. It was a word that had been whispered in the locker rooms for weeks, but seeing it manifest in the tremors of Marcus's hands made it real. Dead as a rot, Sarah, Marcus muttered as I walked past him to clock in. He didn't look at me. He was staring at the basement door, a heavy, steel-reinforced slab that led to the dry storage and the special imports he'd been obsessed with lately. It's a parasite. It eats the pride first, then the soul. But I found a way to starve the beast. A new supplier. A deep connection. He began to laugh, a dry, rattling sound that died in his throat as Jack entered behind me. Jack, my rock, the only thing in this crumbling world that felt solid. He offered a small, weary nod to Marcus, but I saw his hand twitch toward mine, seeking that silent reassurance we traded like contraband. Marcus's gaze snapped to Jack, and for a second, the chef's erratic energy stilled into something predatory and focused. Throughout the lunch service, Marcus was a man possessed. He didn't cook, he prowled. He spent most of his time near that basement door, muttering in a low rhythmic cadence that sounded less like English and more like a chant. When he thought no one was looking, he would press his ear against the cold steel of the walk-in fridge, his expression one of rapt, terrifying attention, as if the hum of the compressors was a voice he was trying to understand. I watched him from the pantry, a cold knot of dread tightening in my chest. Something is wrong, Jack, I whispered during a rare 5-minute break behind the dumpsters, where the city's grime felt honester than the bistro's air. The way Marcus is looking at that basement, the way he talks about imports. We should leave. We can find work at the diner on 4th. Anywhere but here. Jack took a long drag of his cigarette, the embers glowing like a warning light in the overcast afternoon. He looked at me and I saw the desperate hope, that is the curse of the poor. It's a hope that blinds you to the cliff's edge because you're too busy looking at the gold at the bottom. We owe 3 months on the electricity, Sarah. The landlord is threatening to change the locks by Friday. We can't just walk away from a paycheck. It's more than a paycheck, Jack. It's a trap. I can feel it in the walls, I said, my voice trembling. The bistro seemed to groan behind us, a settling of timber that sounded like a sigh of relief. Marcus pulled me aside this morning, Jack said. ignoring my fear with the practiced stoicism of a man who has had to provide for too long. He offered me a night shift. Off the books. Just me and him, prepping this special meat for the new signature dish. He offered a $5,000 bonus. Gosh, tonight. The number hit me like a physical blow. $5,000. It was our salvation. It was a new apartment in a neighborhood where the sirens didn't scream all night. It was a car that started on the first try. It was a future. But as the hope flared in my mind, the bad omens surged like a black tide to extinguish it. I remembered the metallic tang in the air. I remembered the rhythmic thumping I'd heard in the walls of our apartment, which now seemed to be echoing from the bistro's basement. No, I whispered. Jack, no. Why you? Why at night? Why so much money just to prep meat? He says I'm the only one he trusts. He says I have the right spirit for the work, Jack replied, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, a brief recognition of the shadow I was seeing. But he pushed it down, burying it under the crushing weight of our necessity. Sarah, it's one night. One night of work and we're free. We can breathe again. Don't you want to breathe? I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that the air in Thorne's bistro was already too thick to breathe, that it was becoming a soup of charcoal and copper. But I looked at his worn-out shoes and the faint tremors in his hands from exhaustion, and I felt the gravity of our poverty pulling us down. Desperate hope is a hallucination of a ladder when you're drowning, and Jack was already reaching for the rungs. As the sun began to dip below the skyline, casting long, skeletal shadows across the kitchen, Marcus Thorne approached us. He seemed calmer now, but it was the calm of a storm's eye. He handed Jack a heavy brass key. The basement, Jack. 10 p.m. The walk-in is waiting. We have a lot of prep to do if we're going to save this place. Marcus looked at me then, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were like two black holes, consuming the light of the room. Don't worry, Sarah. I'll take good care of him. He's going to be the heart of this bistro. Truly. The word heart hung in the air, vibrating with a significance that made my skin crawl. I reached out and grabbed Jack's sleeve, my fingers digging into the fabric. I wanted to pull him away, to run until our lungs burned, but the bistro seemed to expand, the walls stretching until the exit felt miles away. I'll be home by dawn, Jack promised, leaning in to kiss my forehead. His skin felt unnaturally cold, as if the walk-in fridge had already begun to claim him. 5,000, Sarah. Just think about the house with the garden. Think about the quiet. I watched him walk toward the basement stairs, his silhouette swallowed by the encroaching gloom of the lower level. Marcus followed him, pausing at the top of the stairs to look back at me. He placed a finger to his lips, a gesture of silence that felt like a seal on a tomb. I stood alone in the darkening kitchen, the only sound the aggressive, mechanical hum of the refrigerators. I walked over to the walk-in, the one Marcus had been whispering to. I pressed my ear against the cold, stainless steel door. At first there was only the vibration of the motor. But then, beneath the mechanical noise, I heard it. A faint, wet thud. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the sound of a machine. It was a heartbeat, slow, agonizing, and impossibly loud in the silence of the bistro. And as I stood there, a single frozen tear tracking down my cheek, I realized the secrets of the walk-in fridge weren't about food at all. They were about a hunger that could never be satisfied, and a debt that was about to be paid with the only currency we had left. The shadows in the kitchen seemed to lean in, whispering Jack's name in 1,000 different voices. The radiator didn't clank tonight. It wheezed, a rhythmic, dying gasp that filled the hollow silence of our apartment. I sat on the edge of the bed, the springs groaning under a weight that felt far heavier than my own body. The clock on the bedside table, a cheap plastic thing with a cracked face, ticked with the precision of a guillotine. 2 a.m. 3 a.m. Each second was a drop of icy water on the back of my neck. Jack should have been home by midnight. Even with a slow cleanup or a lingering special prep, with Marcus, the walk from Thorne's bistro took 20 minutes. At most, 30 if the wind was particularly vicious. But tonight, the city was a tomb. I watched the shadows of the fire escape dance across the peeling wallpaper, transforming into skeletal fingers that seemed to reach for the empty space beside me. The bed was cold. I had left the light on in the kitchen, a beacon for a traveler who was never appearing on the horizon. My anxiety, which had begun as a dull ache in Chapter 2, was now a jagged living thing, clawing at the walls of my stomach. Every time a car braked on the street below, my heart would leap into my throat, only to shatter when the engine revved and moved on, leaving me in a deeper, more profound silence. By 5 a.m., the gray light of a winter dawn began to bleed through the grime on the windows. It wasn't a sunrise, it was a slow uncovering of a world that felt fundamentally altered. I didn't even put on a coat. I threw on a shawl, my breath hitching in my chest as I fumbled with the 3 locks on our door. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and old cigarettes, a scent that suddenly felt like a warning. The walk to the bistro was a blur of concrete and terror. The city buildings felt taller, leaning in as if to whisper secrets about where Jack had gone. The wind didn't howl today, it hissed. It felt as though the very geography of the neighborhood had shifted, the streets stretching out like elastic, making the 3 blocks feel like 3 miles. My name is Sarah, and by the time I reached the service entrance of Thorne's Bistro, I was no longer a person. I was a vibration of pure, unadulterated fear. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open, the bell above the door chiming with a dissonant, metallic clatter that echoed through the empty dining room. The bistro smelled different. The bleach was gone, replaced by a scent so rich, so cloyingly sweet, that it made my head spin. It was the smell of the short ribs, but it was amplified, a heavy ancestral aroma that felt like it had a weight of its own. Jack. I called out, my voice sounding small and brittle against the mahogany walls. He's not here, Sarah. Chef Marcus Thorne stepped out from the kitchen. He wasn't the trembling, erratic man I had seen yesterday. He was composed. His white coat was pristine, his hair slicked back. But it was his eyes that stopped my heart. They weren't just dark. They were glassy, reflecting the golden light of the chandeliers like the eyes of a taxidermied animal. He was holding a cup of black coffee, the steam rising in a straight, unnatural line. Where is he, Marcus? He never came home, I said, my voice rising into a frantic pitch. I moved toward the basement stairs, but Marcus stepped into my path with a speed that felt predatory. He's a thief, Sarah, Marcus said, his tone flat, almost bored. After you left, I went to the office to get the cash for his bonus. I caught him with his hands in the safe. He took the $5,000 plus the weekend's deposits and he ran. He's gone. Swallowed by the city. The lie hit me like a physical blow. No, that's impossible. Jack would never, he was doing this for us. He wouldn't skip town without me. People change when they see that much green, Sarah, Marcus replied, taking a slow sip of his coffee. He looked me right in the eye, told me he was tired of this sweet poverty, and the radiator that doesn't work. He wanted a real life. Just not with you. The room began to tilt. The mahogany walls seemed to pulse, the wood grain shifting like slow-moving snakes. I could hear it then, the sound from the night before, but louder. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from beneath the floorboards, a heavy, wet vibration that matched the frantic rhythm of my own heart. You're lying, I whispered, my vision blurring. I can hear him. He's here. I've already called the police to report the theft, Marcus said, ignoring my breakdown. If I were you, I'd go home and start packing. Without Jack's income, you'll be on the street by Monday. I'm doing you a favor by not reporting you as an accomplice. I fled. I didn't run home, I ran to the 14th precinct. The station was a cathedral of fluorescent lights and indifference. I sat on a hard plastic chair for 3 hours, my hands shaking so violently I had to sit on them to keep them still. When an officer finally saw me, a man named Miller whose eyes were as gray as the slush outside, he didn't see a grieving wife. He saw a nuisance. Look, Mrs. Miller, he said, tapping a pen against a stack of paperwork. Chef Thorne has a stellar reputation in this precinct. He's provided a statement and a record of the missing funds. Your husband took the money and split. It happens every day in this city. A guy gets a taste of real cash and he realizes he doesn't want the baggage. He didn't take the money. Something happened in that basement. I screamed, my voice cracking, the hysteria finally breaking the dam. I can hear his heart. The bistro is breathing. Officer Miller looked at his partner and gave a subtle, pitying shake of his head. We'll put out a bolo for the vehicle he might have stolen, but honestly, he's probably halfway to Canada or deep in Vegas by now. My advice? Go home. Drink some tea. Accept the win. He left you the apartment, didn't he? I walked out into the cold, the indifference of the law feeling like a shroud. The city felt monstrous now. The skyscrapers were teeth, and the subway grates were vents for a giant, hidden lung. Jack hadn't just disappeared. He had been erased by a world that valued Chef Thorne's signature sauce more than a working man's life. I returned to our apartment, but it wasn't mine anymore. It was a shell. I threw myself onto the kitchen floor, my nails clawing at the linoleum Jack and I had sat on just 24 hours ago. The silence was gone. The thumping in the walls had followed me home. It was everywhere now, in the pipes, in the wind, in the very air I breathed. "Jack," I wailed into the dark. "Where are you?" The radiator clanked, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, the steam that hissed out formed the shape of a hand with a wedding ring. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, but the message was clear. The city hadn't swallowed Jack. Marcus Thorne had. And as the hysteria settled into a cold, hard marrow of despair, I realized that I was the only one left to hear the heartbeat in the stockpot. I was the only one who knew that the city's hunger was just beginning. Chapter 4. An Unfamiliar Scent. The world did not stop for my grief. It simply accelerated, leaving me breathless and bruised in its wake. 3 days had passed since the night the city, or the bistro, had swallowed Jack whole. 3 days of waking up to a silent radiator and a bed that felt like a vast, icy tundra. I moved through the apartment like a ghost, my name, Sarah, feeling like a word from a forgotten language. But while my personal world had collapsed into a black hole, Thorne's bistro had undergone a terrifying resurrection. I was forced back to work by the cruel gravity of necessity and Marcus's veiled threats. As I approached the bistro on that third afternoon, I didn't find the usual quiet, failing storefront. Instead, the sidewalk was a chaotic nest of activity. Bright ring lights on tripods stood like skeletal sentries outside the glass doors. Influencers, their faces painted in thick layers of digital-ready perfection, posed with pouting lips and hungry eyes, their phones capturing every angle of the building as if it were a holy sight. They were here for the signature short ribs, the dish that had gone viral overnight, turning Marcus Thorne from a failing chef into a culinary messiah. The moment I pushed through the service entrance, the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of a kitchen, it was an atmosphere. It was thick, cloying, and impossibly sweet, like caramelized sugar and dark, heavy wine. But beneath that seductive top note was something that made the copper fillings in my teeth ache. It was a metallic, coppery undertone, the sharp, unmistakable scent of a fresh nosebleed or a rusted blade. It was a scent that didn't just linger in the nose. It sat on the back of the tongue, a heavy, iron-rich weight that triggered a wave of nausea so violent I had to lean against the industrial dishwasher for support. "Move it, Sarah. We have a line out the door and 3 influencers at table 4 waiting for the signature." Marcus's voice cut through my haze. He looked radiant. His skin was flush with a feverish glow, his eyes bright and wide as if he were perpetually on the verge of an epiphany. He moved with a jittery, unnatural speed. Every time he passed the massive, bubbling stockpot at the center of the kitchen, he would dip a silver spoon in and taste the sauce, a look of religious ecstasy crossing his face. The signature short ribs were being plated with a precision that bordered on the ritualistic, each portion glistening with a dark, ruby-red glaze that looked more like liquid garnets than food. I was handed a tray of 3 plates. The weight of them felt wrong, heavy as if the meat had a gravitational pull of its own. As I walked out into the dining room, the nausea intensified. The room was a cacophony of artificial light and performative gluttony. Influencers held their phones inches from the meat, narrating the fall-off-the-bone tenderness to thousands of invisible viewers. They talked about the depth of the soul in the sauce, unaware of the literal truth of their words. I set the plates down at table 4. The woman sitting there, her hair dyed a platinum blonde that looked like spun glass, didn't look at me. She didn't see the dark circles under my eyes or the way my hands were trembling. She only saw the meat. She took a bite, her eyes rolling back in her head, a small, involuntary moan escaping her lips. "Oh my God," she whispered to her camera. "This isn't just food. It's like a heartbeat on a plate." I felt the bile rise in my throat. My vision blurred, the golden chandeliers of the bistro beginning to spin like carousel lights. The thumping I had heard in the walls of our apartment was here too, but it was louder now, a rhythmic, wet thump-thump-thump-thump that seemed to be coming from the very center of the dining room. I looked at the dark glaze on the ribs, and for a split second, the red liquid seemed to pulse, a tiny rhythmic contraction that sent a jolt of pure electricity through my fingertips. I retreated to the pantry, my breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. The confusion was a fog, thick and suffocating. How could everyone be so happy? How could they eat so ravenously while my heart was being torn out of my chest? The bistro felt like a giant, hungry mouth, and I was the one feeding it. I looked at the swinging kitchen doors, the rhythmic squeak-squeak of the hinges sounding like a child's whimpering. Everywhere I looked, I saw Jack. Not in the flesh, but in the echoes of the room. I saw him in the way the steam rose from the pots, forming the shape of a broad shoulder. I saw him in the way the shadows fell across the mahogany tables, looking like a man reaching out his hand. But most of all, I smelled him. Beneath the cloying sweetness of the ribs and the metallic tang of the sauce, there was the faint, lingering scent of his laundry detergent and the cedarwood cologne he only wore on special occasions. It was an impossible, haunting mixture, the scent of the man I loved buried beneath the aroma of the thing that was making Marcus Thorne rich. The nausea wasn't just physical, it was a rejection by my soul. My body was telling me a truth that my mind was too terrified to accept. Marcus Thorne walked into the pantry, his presence bringing a wave of that heavy, metallic scent with him. He stood too close, his shadow engulfing me. They love it, Sarah. The city is finally paying attention. We're going to be legends. Where is he, Marcus? I whispered, my voice a ghost of itself. The smell? It's not right. This isn't just beef. Marcus laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear, his fingers feeling like ice against my feverish skin. It's art, Sarah. And art requires a certain commitment. You should be proud. Jack is finally doing something significant for this bistro. He's the foundation of everything now. He walked away, leaving me in the dim light of the pantry. I looked down at my hands, the skin stained with a faint reddish residue from the plates I had carried. I tried to wipe it off on my apron, but it wouldn't come away. It felt like it was soaking into my pores, a permanent mark of my participation in this nightmare. The bistro outside was a roar of approval, a sea of flashing screens and clinking silverware. The signature short ribs were being devoured, the essence of Jack being metabolized by a city that didn't even know his name. I leaned my head against the cool metal of the shelving, the rhythmic thumping in the floorboards growing so loud it felt like it was beating inside my own chest. I was drowning in a sea of sweet, coppery UAP, my name, Sarah, sinking into the dark, ruby-red glaze of a story that was only just beginning its descent into the abyss. The unfamiliar scent wasn't just a bamboo, it was a calling, a misty's resonance that promised that while Jack might be gone from the world of the living, he was far from finished with Thorne's Bistro. The dining room of Thorne's Bistro had become a theater of the grotesque, a gilded cage where the fine line between human and beast was being systematically erased by the stroke of a silver fork. The air was thick, not just with the coppery sweetness of the sauce, but with the heavy, humid heat of dozens of bodies packed together in a space that had forgotten how to breathe. I moved through the tables, my name, Sarah, feeling like a weightless ghost caught in a storm of primal hunger. The patrons, once the elite of the city, people who obsessed over vintage wine pairings and the subtle notes of organic herbs, now looked like something dragged out of a fever dream. They weren't just eating, they were succumbing. I watched a man at table 12, a lawyer I recognized from the morning news, his expensive silk tie dipped in the dark ruby-red glaze of the ribs. He didn't care. His eyes were glazed over, the pupils pinpricks of black in a sea of milky white, focused with a terrifying singular intensity on the meat before him. He chewed with a rhythmic, mechanical motion, his jaw working with the relentless force of an industrial press. Every few seconds he would let out a low, guttural sound, not quite a moan, but a vibration of pure, animalistic satisfaction that seemed to resonate in the very floorboards beneath my feet. The dining room was silent, save for the wet, rhythmic sounds of mastication and the aggressive clinking of silverware against porcelain. No one spoke. No one looked up. The influencers who had brought their ring lights and cameras had forgotten to narrate. Their devices sat on the tables, recording hours of silent, ravenous consumption. It was as if Marcus Thorne hadn't just created a viral dish. He had unleashed a contagion of gluttony that stripped away the veneer of civilization, leaving only the raw, pulsing need to consume. I felt a wave of profound disgust wash over me, a soul-deep revulsion at the spectacle. These people were metabolizing Jack. They were taking the man who had shared his staff meal with me in a drafty apartment, the man who had promised me a garden and a life of quiet, and they were turning him into calories, into social media clout, into a temporary satiation of a hunger that felt bottomless. I wanted to scream, to overturn the tables and throw the plates against the mahogany walls, but my body felt heavy, anchored by the same dark, coppery UAP that seemed to have enchanted the room. "Clear table 8, Sarah," Marcus whispered as he passed me. His voice was a cold breeze against my ear, and his skin seemed to glow with a sickly, iridescent sheen, as if the success of the bistro was literally illuminating his flesh. He looked at the crowd with the pride of a god watching his creation, his eyes reflecting the flickering candlelight in a way that made him look entirely inhuman. I approached table 8. The couple there had finished their portions, their plates wiped so clean by their bread that the porcelain shone like a mirror. They sat in a stupor, their breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, their hands resting on the table like dead weights. I reached down to take the woman's plate, my fingers trembling. As I pulled it toward the edge of the table, I noticed something left behind, a small, pale object tucked under a garnish of withered rosemary. My heart didn't just skip, it seemed to stop entirely, the rhythm of the room's heartbeat suddenly becoming a deafening roar in my ears. It was a piece of gristle, or so it seemed at first glance. But as I looked closer, the atmospheric horror of the room condensed into a single point of sharp, crystalline terror. It was curved, ivory white, and tipped with a small, jagged edge where it had been severed. It wasn't a bone from a rib. It was a knuckle. Specifically, it was the middle knuckle of a human finger, the skin around it having been cooked into a translucent, gelatinous film that still clung to the bone. I could see the faint, ghostly indentation where a wedding ring might have once sat, a memory of a commitment written in bone and blood. The nausea I had been fighting for days finally won. I doubled over, my hand flying to my mouth, the metallic tang of the sauce suddenly filling my throat like a flood. I looked at the woman who had just cleared that plate. She looked at me, her eyes slowly coming back into focus, a thin trail of dark sauce staining the corner of her mouth. She didn't look horrified. She looked expectant. "The texture," she whispered, her voice a dry, papery rasp. It was so familiar. Like something I've known my whole life. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I grabbed the plate and fled toward the kitchen, the knuckle rattling against the porcelain with a sound that felt like Jack's voice trying to break through a wall of ice. I burst through the swinging doors, my breath coming in jagged, hysterical sobs. The kitchen was a blur of steam and shadow, the massive stockpot in the center bubbling with a renewed, violent energy. I looked at the piece of bone on the plate, my vision blurring with tears. This was it. This was the proof. This was the secret ingredient Marcus Thorne had used to save his bistro. My Jack, my beautiful hard-working Jack, had been reduced to a discardable scrap, a piece of gristle left behind by a woman who didn't even know his name. The disgust I felt for the customers was now eclipsed by a cold, sharp hatred for Marcus Thorne, a hatred that felt like a needle being threaded through my heart. I looked at the basement door, the one Marcus kept locked, and I realized that the special prep hadn't just been a night shift. It had been a funeral service where the deceased was served as the main course. I leaned against the stainless steel prep table, the metal cold against my forehead. The rhythmic thumping in the floorboards was no longer a mystery. It was a drumbeat. It was the city's heart, now synchronized with the remnants of Jack's, beating a warning to anyone who dared to listen. The bistro wasn't just a restaurant anymore, it was a digestive tract, and I was the only thing inside it that hadn't been swallowed whole. I looked at the knuckle one last time before sliding it into the pocket of my apron, a small, horrific relic of the man I had lost. The American winter outside might be cold, but here, in the heart of Thorne's bistro, the heat of the ovens was beginning to feel like the first lick of an eternal fire. I stood up, my name, Sarah, hardening into a blade of ice. The perjamuan was far from over, but the roles were about to shift. The gluttonous customers outside continued to eat, their teeth grinding against the remnants of a soul, unaware that the heart they were consuming was about to beat its way back out of their throats. Chapter 6. Whispers from the Stockpot. The midnight hour in Thorne's bistro didn't bring peace. It brought a heavy, suffocating weight that seemed to press the very air from my lungs. The grand dining room, once a sea of gluttonous faces and flashing screens, was now a cavern of elongated shadows and skeletal furniture. But the kitchen was where the darkness truly lived. It was a landscape of cold stainless steel and sharp edges, illuminated only by the flickering, sickly hum of a single fluorescent tube that threatened to die at any moment. My name is Sarah, and tonight, the kitchen felt like a crime scene where the evidence was being slowly, methodically digested by the building itself. I was alone, or so I told myself, clutching a wire scrub brush until my knuckles were white and raw. My task was a penance I had assigned myself, cleaning the massive industrial stockpot that sat at the center of the kitchen like a hollowed-out god. It was a vat of scorched metal, still radiating a faint, unnatural heat even though the burners had been off for hours. The smell of the signature short ribs lingered, no longer seductive, but turning into something sour and fermented, the scent of a grave left open in the rain. As I leaned over the rim of the pot, the steam, thick, gray and smelling of copper, rose to meet me. It didn't dissipate like normal water vapor. It curled around my head, clinging to my hair and skin like wet silk. I began to scrub, the sound of the wire against the metal a harsh, rhythmic scree-scree-scree that echoed through the hollow bistro. Sarah. I froze. The brush slipped from my hand, clattering against the bottom of the pot with a sound like a gunshot. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The voice hadn't come from the dining room or the service entrance. It had come from inside the pot. It was a rasp, a wet, breathy exaltation that sounded like wind passing through a broken reed. It was Jack's voice, but stripped of its warmth, hollowed out by the coldness of the basement. "Jack," I whispered, my voice trembling so violently I could barely form the word. The steam swirled faster, thickening into a dense, roiling fog. For a heartbeat, the gray mist seemed to coalesce into the shape of a jaw, a broad forehead, the curve of a shoulder I had rested my head on 1,000 times. I reached out, my fingers trembling, wanting to touch the ghost of the man who had been my only sanctuary. Longing, sharp and agonizing, tore through the fear. I wanted him back, even like this, even as a collection of whispers and vapor. "Sarah, help me, it's so cold, the bamboo, it burns." The whisper was followed by a low, bubbling gurgle from the drain at the bottom of the pot. I recoiled, my heels catching on the greasy floor. As the steam momentarily cleared, I saw something glinting in the dark slurry of fat and gray water at the bottom of the vessel. I reached in, my hand plunging into the lukewarm, oily mess. My fingers brushed against something hard and circular. I pulled it out. It was Jack's wedding ring. The simple silver band, the one he had insisted on buying even when we could barely afford bread, was stained with a dark, iridescent film. It wasn't just dirty, it felt heavy, vibrating with the same rhythmic thump-thump that I had been hearing in the walls. I clutched it to my chest, a sob breaking from my throat. This was the ring he never took off. He had joked once that it would have to be cut off his finger because his knuckles were too thick from years of heavy lifting. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, a wave of extreme fear that turned my blood to ice. If the ring was here at the bottom of the pot, then Marcus hadn't just used Jack's heart. He had processed everything. Hysteria, cold and sharp, began to fray the edges of my mind. I began to look around the kitchen, possessed by a frantic, terrifying need to find more of him. I checked the spice rack, my hands knocking over jars of cumin and star anise. There, tucked inside a tin of expensive smoked paprika, was a single plastic button, the one Jack had been complaining about being loose on his favorite flannel shirt. I moved to the industrial whisk hanging from a magnetic strip. Entwined in the wire loops was a lock of coarse, dark hair, still smelling faintly of the cedarwood cologne he wore. Each discovery was a fresh wound, a piece of a jigsaw puzzle that depicted a horror too vast to comprehend. Marcus Thorne hadn't just murdered my husband. He had deconstructed him, scattering the pieces of his life into the machinery of his success. The kitchen lights flickered and died, plunging me into a darkness so absolute it felt physical. The only light came from the red on button of the walk-in fridge, glowing like a cyclopean eye. "He's watching, Sarah." The whisper was louder now, coming from the vents, the drains, the very blades of the knives hanging on the wall. "The chef, he's still hungry?" I felt a presence behind me, a cold, stagnant pressure that made the hair on my neck stand up. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I knew that if I did, I wouldn't see Marcus Thorne. I would see something else, the thing Marcus was becoming, fueled by the imports and the heart he had stolen. The rhythmic thumping in the floorboards intensified, a deafening boom-boom, boom-boom that shook the stainless steel tables. The stockpot began to vibrate, the metal groaning as if it were being stretched from the inside. A dark, viscous liquid began to ooze from the rim, spilling onto the floor in a slow, ruby-red tide. It wasn't sauce. It was too thick, too bright. It was the signature, returning to claim the kitchen. I backed away, clutching the ring and the button, my name, Sarah, a silent prayer on my lips. The longing for Jack was now entirely eclipsed by a primal, supernatural terror. The bistro wasn't a place of business anymore. It was an altar, and the stockpot was the vessel for a resurrection I wasn't prepared to witness. "I'm sorry, Jack," I sobbed, my voice lost in the roar of the vibrating metal. "I'm so sorry." From the darkness of the basement stairs, I heard a footstep. Not a human footstep, a wet, heavy thud, followed by the sound of something metallic dragging across the concrete. Thump. Thump. I realized then that the whispers weren't just a warning. They were a welcome. Jack was coming back, but he wasn't coming back for me. He was coming for the man who had turned his love into a signature. And as I stood there in the dark, the metallic tang of the ribs filling my lungs like a poison, I knew that I was no longer just a witness. I was the bridge between the living and the butchered. The fluorescent light flickered back on for a split second, and in that flash I saw a shadow standing by the stockpot. It was tall, its chest a jagged, empty ruin, and it was holding a silver spoon. Then the light died for good. The air in the basement of Thorne's Bistro didn't just linger, it possessed. It was a thick, necrotic soup of damp concrete, industrial-strength degreaser, and that ever-present cloying sweetness that I now recognized as the scent of a soul being rendered into fat. Every step I took down the iron-grated stairs felt like a descent into the throat of a beast. The rhythm of the city above, the distant sirens of a cold American night, the rumble of the subway, felt like a dream from a former life. My name is Sarah, and as I reached the bottom step, I realized I was no longer a woman looking for her husband. I was a mourner entering a tomb that refused to be silent. The basement was a labyrinth of shadows, illuminated only by the intermittent, stuttering flicker of a failing light fixture. At the far end of the hallway stood the heavy oak door to Marcus Thorne's private office. It was the only part of the building that didn't feel modern. It felt ancient, a splinter of old-world malice embedded in the heart of this frantic city. I approached it with a heavy pipe wrench I had scavenged from the maintenance closet, my hands so numb with cold and terror that they felt like blocks of wood. The lock didn't just break, it shrieked. The sound echoed through the concrete corridors like a dying bird, a sharp, metallic violation of Marcus's sanctuary. I pushed the door open, and the smell hit me with the force of a physical blow, not the aroma of the short ribs but the raw, coppery stench of a slaughterhouse. Inside, the office was a nightmare of contradiction. One wall was lined with high-end culinary awards and framed reviews from the New York Times, while the desk was covered in a chaotic spread of objects that had nothing to do with gastronomy. There were strange, heavy vials filled with iridescent fluids that seemed to glow with a faint, sickly green light. There were jars of imports that Marcus had touted, not exotic spices but gray, preserved tissues floating in brine, labeled in a jagged, frantic script that I couldn't decipher. But it was the object draped over the back of Marcus's leather chair that stopped my breath. It was Jack's work apron. The heavy canvas was no longer gray, it was a deep, stiffened maroon, caked in layers of dried blood that looked like topographical maps of a continent of pain. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched the Jack name tag pinned to the chest. The fabric still held the faint, lingering scent of his skin, that cedarwood and hard-working sweat, now buried under the overwhelming reek of iron. My knees hit the concrete floor with a dull thud. The despair was no longer a wave, it was an ocean, and I was sinking into its crushing depths. I clutched the apron to my face, letting out a sound that wasn't a cry, but a jagged, visceral moan of total mental collapse. Jack hadn't skipped town. He hadn't stolen the money. He had been harvested. I began to tear through the papers on the desk, my movements frantic and uncoordinated. Beneath a stack of invoices, I found the grimoires, ancient, leather-bound texts with titles like The Sovereign Heart and The Altar of the Appetite. These weren't cookbooks, they were manuals for urban occultism. I read the passages Marcus had underlined in red, the words searing themselves into my brain. The spirit of the lamb is insufficient for the greatness of the lion. To feed a city of hollow souls, one must offer a heart that has known the fullness of love. The essence must be slow braised in the heat of its own betrayal. The realization hit me with crystalline, horrifying clarity. The signature short ribs weren't a recipe. They were a ritual. Marcus Thorne hadn't just murdered Jack. He had used his heart, his love, his very essence to fuel the bistro's sudden success. Every influencer who had moaned in delight, every foodie who had praised the depth of the sauce, had been an unwitting participant in a cannibalistic mass. They were metabolizing my husband's soul, turning his devotion into a temporary high, a viral sensation. I looked at the strange vials on the desk. They weren't preservatives. They were catalysts designed to tether a spirit to its physical remains. That was why I could still hear him. That was why the bistro was breathing. Marcus hadn't let Jack die. He had trapped him in the food, in the walls, in the very air we breathed. My husband was the secret ingredient that made the world finally notice Marcus Thorne. Total despair, cold and sharp as a butcher's hook, settled into my marrow. I looked around the room and for the first time I saw the city for what it truly was. A machine that ground up people like Jack and Sarah to keep its lights bright and its bellies full. We were the grease for the gears. We were the imports that made the elite feel alive for a moment. "I'm sorry, Jack," I whispered into the blood-stained canvas of the apron. "I'm so sorry I let you go into the basement." The shadows in the room seemed to lean in, whispering my name in 1,000 different voices. The voices of the people who had eaten at table 4, the voices of the influencers, all of them echoing with a hunger that could never be satisfied. I felt my reality shattering, the boundaries between the living and the dead, the sacred and the profane, dissolving into a gray, hopeless fog. I looked at the heavy brass key Marcus had given Jack on that final night, still sitting on the desk. It wasn't a key to a freezer, it was a key to an altar. And I was the only one left who knew the price of the feast. From the hallway outside I heard a wet, heavy thud. Thump, thump, thump. The heartbeat was louder now, echoing through the concrete floorboards, vibrating through the soles of my shoes. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a summons. The despair in my heart began to shift, the cold ice of my grief cracking under the pressure of a new, darker emotion. I stood up, clutching Jack's apron to my chest like a holy relic. The mental collapse was complete, but in its place, a singular, jagged purpose began to form. If Marcus Thorne wanted to serve a dish with a soul, then I would make sure he tasted every ounce of the agony he had created. The bistro above was silent now, the gluttons gone home to sleep off their perjamuan, but the basement was alive. The city might have swallowed Jack, but it hadn't digested him yet. And as I stepped out of the office and into the dark corridor, I knew that the signature was about to demand a final, bloody reckoning. The American night outside was indifferent, but here, in the cold, wet heart of Thorne's bistro, the debt was finally coming due. My name is Sarah, and I am the only one who knows that the best recipes are the ones written in the blood of the people who loved you. The gold leaf success of Thorne's bistro had become a shroud, and inside that shroud, Marcus Thorne was suffocating. My name is Sarah, and from the charcoal-stained shadows of the pantry, I watched the king of this culinary empire crumble into a frantic, guttering candle. The American night outside was a frozen landscape of indifferent skyscrapers, but inside these mahogany walls, the heat was becoming a living thing. The signature short ribs had brought Marcus fame, viral reels, and a bank account overflowing with blood money, but it had also brought him an uninvited guest who refused to leave the kitchen. It began with the heartbeat. It wasn't the rhythmic thumping in the pipes anymore, it had migrated. It was now a physical invasion. Marcus sat at the pass-through, his face the color of spoiled cream, clutching a glass of expensive scotch that vibrated in his hand. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was so loud it seemed to ripple the surface of the amber liquid. It wasn't just in the air, it was sounding from within his own skull, a heavy, wet percussion that matched the frantic, dying pulse of a cornered animal. Every beat was a footstep of the man he had dismantled, a reminder that Jack's heart was no longer being digested by the city, it was beating inside the chef's very conscience. Marcus stood up, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, the predator now fully aware that the scent in the air was his own fear. He walked toward the line, the vast canyons of stainless steel appliances shimmering under the flickering fluorescent lights. This had been his kingdom, his altar of chrome and fire. But as he passed the industrial refrigerator, he stopped, his breath hitching in a jagged, crystalline gasp. In the brushed steel reflection of the freezer door, he didn't see himself. He saw a shape. It was Jack, but Jack rendered in the same dark ruby-red glaze as the ribs. His husband stood behind him in the reflection, his chest a hollowed-out cavern of raw muscle and broken ribs, his eyes two pits of stagnant coppery UAP. The mangled form didn't move, it just existed in the metal, a permanent stain on the chef's reality. Marcus whirled around, his scotch glass shattering on the floor, but the kitchen was empty. Only the hum of the compressors answered him, a mechanical drone that seemed to be humming Jack's favorite song. "You're not there," Marcus whispered, his voice a dry, papery rasp that barely clawed its way out of his throat. "I processed you. You're gone. You're in the profit margins. You're in the reviews." He fled toward the office, but the digital eyes of the bistro were waiting for him. The security monitors, a grid of 9 glowing screens, usually showed the empty dining room and the quiet sidewalk of the Chicago night. But tonight the pixels were bleeding. On screen 4, the basement corridor was filled with a thick, crimson mist. On screen 7, the walk-in fridge door was slowly swinging open, and a hand, Jack's hand, with the silver wedding ring I still clutched in my apron pocket, was reaching out from the frost. Marcus collapsed into his leather chair, the same one where I had found Jack's bloody apron. He stared at the monitors, his eyes wide and bloodshot, unable to look away as the mangled figure of Jack Miller began to appear in every frame. Jack wasn't running, he was just arriving. He was in the pantry. He was by the stockpot. He was standing right outside the office door, his empty chest cavity pulsing with that deafening rhythmic thump-thump. The fear was a physical weight now, a predatory gravity that pulled Marcus down into the seat of his own sins. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the coppery UAP filling his lungs, tasting the metallic tang of the signature on his breath. He was the man who had fed a city on a stolen heart, and now that heart was demanding a home. His hands, once famous for their precision with a paring knife, began to wander. They moved to his own chest, his fingers hooked like talons. He began to scratch. At first it was a nervous tick, a way to drown out the internal heartbeat. But soon, it became a frantic, bloody obsession. He tore through his pristine white chef's coat, his nails digging into the skin over his sternum. He was trying to get to it. He was trying to dig out the sound, to silence the man who was screaming through his own pulse. "Make it stop, Jack," he moaned, the red welts on his chest weeping a dark, oily fluid. "I gave you everything. I made you a legend." I watched him through the crack in the door, a cold, sharp catharsis washing over me. The despair I had felt in the basement was shifting, hardening into a blade. Marcus Thorne was no longer the brilliant architect of my misery. He was a frantic, butchered thing, a man who had forgotten that when you invite the dead to dinner, they always stay for the final course. The American dream he had built was a house of cards, and the wind was finally starting to blow. The heartbeat grew louder, a cacophony of blood that shook the very foundation of the bistro. Marcus was screaming now, a silent, open-mouthed wail as he watched the monitor show the office door, the very door he was sitting behind, slowly creaking open. In the reflection of the computer screen, the mangled form of Jack was leaning over his shoulder, the upholstery needle and black twine glinting in the pale digital light. The predator had finally become the prey, and the bistro was ready to serve the final signature of the night. My name is Sarah, and as I watched Marcus Thorne tear at his own flesh in the dark, I knew that the city's hunger was nothing compared to the hunger of a heart that had been turned into a bamboo. The city didn't just get sick, it began to curdle. Outside the frost-rimmed windows of our cramped apartment, the Chicago skyline felt like a row of jagged teeth biting into a bruised, purple sky. The usual hum of the metropolis, the rhythmic pulse of the L train and the distant, comforting murmur of traffic, had been replaced by a frantic, jagged discordance. Sirens became the new soundtrack of the American night, a relentless, high-pitched wailing that seemed to be searching for a silence that no longer existed. My name is Sarah, and as I sat in the dark, the blue light of my phone screen was the only thing illuminating the wreckage of my soul. I scrolled through the local Yelp pages and social media feeds for Thorne's Bistro. What had started as a wave of religious ecstasy over the signature short ribs, had fermented into a digital gallery of horrors. The reviews were no longer about flavor profiles or wine pairings, they were testimonies from the threshold of hell. Something is wrong. I ate there on Friday. My skin, it's not mine anymore, one user wrote, accompanied by a blurred photo of a forearm covered in weeping ruby-red lesions that formed the unmistakable shape of a human handprint. I can't stop the taste, another post read, time-stamped at 3 a.m. It's not beef. I just threw up. There were things in it. Hard things. I found 2 molars and a jagged piece of a fingernail in the sink. I haven't lost any teeth. Where did they come from? The guilt hit me with the force of a tidal wave, a suffocating pressure that made my lungs feel like they were filled with wet sand. I looked at my own hands, the ones that had carried those heavy, garnet-glazed plates to table after table. I had been the one to set the curse down in front of them. I had seen the gluttony in their eyes, the way they leaned into the metallic, coppery UAP, and I hadn't screamed. I hadn't overturned the tables. I had let them ingest my husband one signature bite at a time. I was the server at a perjamuan of the damned, and the tip I had received was a soul-deep rot that no amount of scrubbing could ever remove. Every siren that screamed past our building felt like a personal accusation. I imagined the hospitals, overcrowded corridors filled with people whose bodies were rejecting a meal that refused to be digested. Jack's heart curse was reassembling itself inside them. He was a splinter in the city's collective gut, a piece of bone trying to find its way back to the light. I could almost hear them in my mind, thousands of voices gagging on the same coppery tang, their stomachs churning with the rhythm of a heartbeat that wasn't theirs. "I'm sorry," I whispered into the hollow darkness of the kitchen. "I'm so sorry." The city was transforming into a hellscape. It wasn't just the illness, it was the atmosphere. The very air felt thicker, more humid, carrying the scent of rosemary and slow-cooking meat even miles away from the bistro. The streetlights flickered in a synchronized thump-thump rhythm that matched the heartbeat I had heard in the basement. People weren't just sick, they were changing. I saw a man on the sidewalk below my window, hunched over a trash can, his body convulsing in a rhythmic, violent heave. When he finally pulled away, he left behind a pile of dark, oily sludge that seemed to pulse and move on its own, a living remnant of the bistro's signature. The horror was no longer confined to the mahogany walls of thorns. It had leaked out into the gutters, into the subway vents, into the very water supply. Jack's essence, rendered into fat and sauce by Marcus's greed, was now part of the city's infrastructure. The imports Marcus had used weren't just occult catalysts. They were anchors tethering Jack's agony to everyone who had been greedy enough to taste it. The influencers who had moaned in delight were now posting frantic updates about phantom pains in their chests, claiming they could hear a man whispering in their ears every time they tried to sleep. I felt a profound disgust for myself, a revulsion that made my skin feel like it was crawling with invisible insects. I had been the bridge. I had facilitated this harvest. Every time I had adjusted a napkin or refilled a water glass, I had been an accomplice to a supernatural massacre. The sweet poverty Jack and I had shared now felt like a lost paradise, a clean, honest struggle compared to the gilded, bloody success we had been drowned in. I looked at the silver wedding ring I still kept in my apron pocket. It felt hot, vibrating against my thigh with a vengeful intensity. He's not just hurting Marcus, I realized, the thought a cold blade in my mind. He's hurting everyone who took a piece of him. The city's hospitals were reporting unprecedented biological anomalies. Doctors were finding bits of denim fabric, wedding ring shards, and cedarwood-scented bile inside patients who had never been near a textile mill or a forest. Jack was trying to come home, but he was doing it by tearing his way through the people who had consumed him. It was a brutal, meticulous reclamation. The heart he had lost was now 1,000 tiny shards, each one a needle searching for its original thread. As the night deepened, a heavy, coppery mist began to roll off Lake Michigan, swallowing the skyscrapers in a ruby-red shroud. The city felt like it was being braised in its own sins. The silence of the apartment was gone, replaced by the collective rhythmic moaning of a metropolis in the throes of a digestive nightmare. I stood by the window watching the flickering lights of Chicago, and I knew that the signature had reached its final stage of fermentation. The guilt was a physical weight, but beneath it, a dark, sharp purpose was beginning to solidify. I couldn't save the city and I couldn't save the people who had turned my husband into a viral reel. But I could finish what Marcus Thorne had started. If the city was a hellscape, then I would be its guide. I would return to the bistro one last time, not as a server, but as a witness to the final bloody settling of the debt. The American winter outside was dying, choked by a heat that came from the earth itself. The heart curse was no longer a secret. It was the new reality of the city. And as I turned away from the window, the blue light of my phone finally flickered and died, leaving me in a darkness that smelled of rosemary, iron, and a love that had been refined into a poison. The dining room of Thorne's Bistro had transformed from a temple of modern culinary excellence into a gilded, digital tomb. Outside, the American storm continued its frantic assault, the charcoal gray rain lashing against the windows with a violence that felt personal. Inside, the air was a thick, stagnant UAP of rosemary and cold iron, a mist so heavy it seemed to dim the emerald glow of the exit signs. My name is Sarah, and as I stood in the deepest shadows of the velvet-draped corner, I felt the last flickering embers of my humanity finally go dark. The woman who had shared a meager staff meal in a drafty apartment was gone. In her place was a silent witness to a debt that was about to be paid in full. Chef Marcus Thorne was a broken machine. I watched him stumble through the darkened dining room, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the dark ruby-red glaze that now oozed from the floorboards like a slow-moving tide. He reached the main entrance, his breath coming in jagged, hysterical gasps that filled the silence of the room. This door, a masterpiece of reinforced oak and smart technology, was supposed to be his ultimate shield. He pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner, his hand shaking so violently he had to hold his wrist with his other hand. Chirp chirp. Access denied. The small LED light on the scanner flashed a mocking blood red. Marcus let out a whimpering sound, a jagged rasp that was the exact opposite of the arrogant commands he used to bark in the kitchen. He tried again, his thumbs smeared with the oily residue of his own fear. Chirp chirp. System locked. No no no, he whispered, the words dying in the thick metallic air. He threw his entire weight against the door, but the electronic smart locks had engaged with a finality that felt supernatural. The bistro had made its choice. It was no longer a place of business. It was a digestive tract, and it had finally caught its prey. Marcus turned toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the reinforced security glass that boasted it could withstand a Category 5 hurricane. He grabbed a heavy mahogany chair, his muscles straining as he swung it with a desperate, animalistic strength. Crack. The chair shattered into splinters, but the glass didn't even ripple. It stood there, dark and indifferent, reflecting the violet flashes of lightning and the mangled form of the man standing behind him. The thumping in the floorboards was no longer a distant sound. It was a physical vibration that rattled the crystal glassware on the tables. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of a heart that had been stolen, now beating for vengeance. Jack moved out from the kitchen, his presence bringing a wave of absolute cold that turned the humidity of the room into a gray UAP. His mangled figure dragged across the floor, a wet, heavy sound that seemed to pull the very shadows with it. His chest cavity remained wide and empty, a gaping abyss that pulsed with a dark, rhythmic intensity. One eye, Jack's eye, was fixed on the chef, but it didn't hold a single spark of the man I had once loved. It held only the heart curse that was currently dismantling the city outside. I watched Marcus realize he was trapped. He collapsed against the glass, sliding down until he was huddled on the floor, his eyes wide and bloodshot as they darted toward the shadows where I stood. Sarah, please, open the overrides. You have the code. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I felt a profound, chilling sense of peace as I surrendered to the darkness that Jack had brought home. The gripping tension in the room was a living thing, a wire stretched so tight it was humming a song of retribution. I thought about the house with the garden we would never have. I thought about the sweet poverty that Marcus had mocked while he harvested my husband's soul. There are no overrides for a soul, Marcus, I thought, though my lips didn't move. The darkness in the room began to thicken, the shadows of the chairs and tables stretching out like skeletal fingers to pin Marcus against the glass. The American night outside seemed to press even closer, the black rain forming the shapes of hands against the window pane, as if the thousands of people who had eaten the signature short ribs were trying to push their way back in to join the perjamuan. Jack was only inches away now. The smell of cedarwood and iron was overwhelming, a scent that triggered a memory of a kiss, then immediately soured into the reality of a butcher's shop. He loomed over Marcus, his silhouette cast in a terrifying jagged outline against the reinforced glass. The chef was no longer screaming. He was making a rhythmic clicking sound in the back of his throat, his mind finally snapping under the weight of the horror. He looked up into Jack's empty chest, and for the first time, I saw the predator truly understand what it felt like to be the ingredient. I closed my eyes for a heartbeat, feeling the bistro's heartbeat synchronize with my own. The tension reached its breaking point, the silence so heavy it felt like it. The air in the dining room of Thorne's Bistro had become a stagnant pond of iron and ancient, boiling spices. The violet flashes of the Chicago storm outside were the only things that gave the room a sense of time, illuminating the carnage in jagged, strobe-like intervals. My name is Sarah, and as I stood in the corner, my back against the cold mahogany, I watched the hierarchy of the world finish its collapse. Marcus Thorne, the man who had once been a titan of the city's culinary elite, was now nothing more than a collection of panicked nerves and expensive fabric. Jack didn't need to use violence to incapacitate him. The heart curse that radiated from Jack's empty chest cavity was a physical weight, an atmospheric pressure that seemed to turn Marcus's bones into lead. I watched as Jack reached out with a hand that looked like gray water-damaged marble. He pressed a single elongated finger against Marcus's forehead, and the chef fell to the floor as if his spine had been turned to water. He lay there, pinned by the gravity of a dead man's amara, his eyes bulging and his mouth opening in a silent, jagged O of pure, unadulterated terror. Jack didn't speak. He didn't need to. The sound of his arrival was a low-frequency hum that vibrated in the crystal glassware and the very marrow of my teeth. From the darkness of his empty chest, he pulled something out. It wasn't an organ. It was a tool, a large, curved upholstery needle, the kind used to stitch together heavy leather and thick velvet. It was rusted, the metal pitted and stained with a dark, iridescent film. Trailing from its eye was a long, heavy length of thick black twine, so dark it seemed to absorb the flickering light of the storm. Jack knelt over Marcus, the movement slow and articulated, like a machine trying to remember how to be human. He reached down and gripped Marcus's chin, his gray fingers digging into the chef's skin with a strength that made the bone creak. The smell of cedarwood and cold iron was overwhelming, a scent that triggered a memory of Jack's laughter before being immediately smothered by the reality of the butcher's block. The first puncture didn't sound like a needle through skin. It sounded like a nail being driven into wet timber. Marcus's eyes nearly flew out of their sockets. He tried to scream, but the sound was caught in his throat, a wet, rattling vibration that only served to spray a fine mist of dark ruby-red glaze onto Jack's gray hand. The needle had entered through the corner of his left lip, piercing through the muscle and emerging from the upper lip with a sickening, wet crunch. Jack pulled the twine through. The sound was a rhythmic shrat-shrat, the coarse fiber of the twine dragging through the fresh wound. It wasn't blood that leaked from the puncture. It was the signature sauce, dark, viscous, and smelling of rosemary and betrayal. Each inch of thread that passed through Marcus's flesh was a second of the time Jack had spent being processed in the basement. One for the lie, the air whispered, the sound vibrating in the mahogany walls. Jack didn't stop. He moved the needle to the center of Marcus's mouth. This time he pushed it through the lower lip, the needle's curve forcing it to exit through the soft palate before coming back out through the skin just below the nose. Marcus's body menjang, his heels drumming a frantic, useless rhythm against the floorboards. I watched, my vision tunneling until all I could see was the glint of the rusted needle and the way Marcus's skin puckered and tore under the strain. The body horror was absolute. The twine was so thick that it acted like a saw, widening the holes as Jack pulled it taut. Marcus's face began to lose its shape, the skin being gathered and bunched together like a piece of cheap upholstery. The ruby-red glaze bubbled from his mouth, coating his chin in a thick, sweet-smelling mask of agony. One for the heart you took, the walls groaned. Jack's movements were meticulous, almost delicate. He was sewing a masterpiece. He crossed the thread, creating a jagged, black X over Marcus's lips. The needle went through again, this time piercing the cheek and pulling the thread across the tongue, pinning it to the floor of the mouth. The sound of the needle hitting teeth was a sharp, metallic clink that made my own jaw ache. Marcus's whimpering was now a low, rhythmic sound, his lungs struggling to find air through the closing gate of his own flesh. I felt a wave of cold, sharp satisfaction. This was the catharsis I hadn't known I needed. This man had used Jack's soul to feed a city of gluttons, and now he was being turned into a doll, his voice, the voice that had lied to me and mocked our poverty, silenced by the very thing he had destroyed. I surrendered entirely to the darkness, letting the smell of the iron and the rosemary fill my lungs until I felt as hollow and as hateful as the man I had once loved. The needle plunged in for the final time, connecting the upper jaw to the lower with a final brutal pull of the black twine. Jack tied a knot, his gray fingers moving with a frightening precision. Marcus's mouth was no longer a mouth. It was a closed seam, a jagged ridge of black thread and torn, bunched flesh that leaked a dark, oily fluid. He lay there, his face a ruin of signature and twine, his eyes still wide and reflecting the violet flashes of the Chicago sky. He was still alive, his chest heaving as he tried to breathe through his nose, but he was no longer the chef. He was just a vessel, a piece of meat that had been prepared for the final stage of the perjamuan. Jack stood up, his height reaching toward the darkened ceiling, his empty chest cavity pulsing with a renewed rhythmic intensity. Thump, thump, thump. The heartbeat was louder now, filling the dining room, shaking the foundations of the bistro. The American storm outside seemed to roar in approval, the black rain forming the shapes of hands against the reinforced glass. "It's time, Sarah," the air hissed. I stepped out of the shadows, my name, Sarah, feeling like a weight I was finally ready to drop. I looked at Marcus, his face a map of black thread retribution, and I felt nothing but a cold, echoing void. The perjamuan was about to reach its peak, and the secret ingredient was finally ready to be tasted by the Koki who had created it. The body horror was the only truth left in this room. The mahogany, the crystal, the awards, they were all lies. The only thing that was real was the blood, the twine, and the hunger that had brought us all back to this cathedral of chrome and fire.